Well, hello again. We are going to continue with our history lesson. This week, Andy led us into Romans chapter 2. He spoke on passing judgment on one another and also on the grace of God. Now, in Romans 2, Paul is not teaching the possibility of salvation by works, but is showing why all men, without exception, are lost. Paul states that no man has continued in doing good, nor is he a doer of the law. Romans 2, if we get into chapter 2, verses 12 and 13, it says, "For all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law. And all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified." Paul is saying that the whole world sins and needs a Savior. Both those under the law, which are the Jews, and those without the law, the Gentiles. So what is this law? We're pretty sure, and most historians, myself also agree, that Paul had in mind the laws that God handed down to Moses. This would include the Ten Commandments, as well as the rest of the commandments for the people of Israel that are found in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, the keepers of these laws were men known as the Pharisees. The Pharisees believed that the law that God gave to Moses was twofold. It consisted of the written law and of the oral law, which, combining the teachings of the prophets and the oral tradition of the Jewish people. It was a big deal to be a Pharisee, to be a keeper of the law. In fact, Paul calls himself a Pharisee. In Acts 23:6, while Paul was on trial, he actually says, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of a Pharisee. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial." Now, Pharisees emerged as a distinct group shortly after the Maccabean Revolt, which took place about 165 to 160 BC. The Maccabean Revolt was a Jewish rebellion against Greek oppressors in Israel, as well as a rejection of Hellenistic compromises in worship. After the death of Alexander the Great, his kingdom was divided up into four areas: Egypt, the Seleucid Empire, the kingdom of Pergamon, and Macedon, which included Greece. Now, Egypt was governed by Ptolemy, who allowed Judaism in Jerusalem to flourish with very, very little intervening. He did not micromanage, did not, get involved. Now, over time, the Seleucid Empire eventually won control over the area of Egypt and began to curtail Jewish religious practices. Antiochus IV came into power, and he chose a name for himself, Antiochus Epiphanes, which means God manifest. He considered himself a strong ruler and rule maker. He began to persecute the Jews, and he outlawed Jewish religious practices. One of the things he outlawed was the observance of the kosher food laws. And he also ordered the worship of the Greek god Zeus. His ultimate act of desecration, he actually sacrificed a pig to the god Zeus inside the temple. It was this very act of desecration, which many would say the last straw, and the result of that was what we call the Maccabean Revolt. Now, Mattathias was a Jewish priest. He led the organized resistance along with his 5 sons: John, Gadi; Simon, Theus; Eleazar, Averon; Jonathan, Apphus; and Judas, Maccabeus. The funny thing about the word Maccabeus, it comes from the Hebrew word for hammer. And we will find that that is a very appropriate word. Now, Mattathias started the rebellion by preventing Jews from sacrificing to any pagan god. And eventually it went along, he ended up killing an officer of the king. Things really got excited then, and they conducted what we would consider a guerrilla type warfare against the Seleucids. Much of their wrath was directed also against fellow Jews who embraced Greek culture, Hellenized Jews that were just continuing to embrace everything against the law. The rebels tore down pagan altars. They circumcised boys and forced these Hellenized Jews to become outlaws with no rights or legal protection. Now, upon Mattathias' death in 166 BC, Judas Maccabeus took command of the rebellion. Now remember, I said his name means hammer. Under the leadership of Judas Maccabeus, the rebellion continued and was very successful. They were so successful that they eventually were able to capture Jerusalem. And the followers of Maccabeus became known as the Maccabees. From there, Maccabeus took the war directly to Galilee in an effort that he was going to reclaim all Jewish territory, which he was very successful. Now, over time, as a result of it, Judas died, and he was succeeded by his brother Jonathan. Now, Jonathan was a little bit different, and while under his leadership, he was able to make a peace with Alexander Belos, the Seleucid king. Now, as I stated before, the Pharisees emerged right after this Maccabean revolt. The name Pharisee actually means separated one. Now, the Pharisees separated themselves from society to study and teach the law, these laws of God passed down to Moses. But they also separated themselves from common people because they considered them religiously unclean. Now, in the beginning, their intentions were good. However, over time, they, like many, began to embrace their power. Because they taught the way to God was to basically obey the laws to the letter. Now, the Pharisees gradually changed Judaism from a religion of sacrifice to one of keeping the commandments. You could say more of a form of legalism, keeping the law, doing the work, showing that you were keeping the laws. There were still animal sacrifices. They still continued in Jerusalem until the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. But at this time, the Pharisees were promoting works over sacrifice. This ends the little short lesson on the revolt and the formation of the Pharisees. We will continue more history as we continue into Romans 2 and as we continue through the book of Romans. I hope you enjoyed this little tidbit. It kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of how things got started and where things are eventually going to lead as we continue in Romans. Thanks.